David Gilmour was never loud, but he was unforgettable. While others chased fame with fireworks, he built cathedrals of emotion with a single note. His guitar didn't entertain, it revealed. Beneath every bend, every pause, lived a man shaped by silence, scarred by loss, and saved by music. You know the solos, but do you know the sorrow? This is the untold story of a legend who spoke softly and left the world forever changed. In a quiet corner of Cambridge behind ivy-covered walls and neatly stacked bookshelves, a boy sat at a dinner table where conversations rarely bloomed. To the outside world, this was an enviable life, educated parents, a picturesque home in the English countryside, and all the makings of stability. But to young David Gilmour, it was a silence that hummed louder than any orchestra. Not the comforting silence of peace, but the aching kind, the one that lingers in cold rooms, in unanswered questions, in glances that look past you rather than into you. His father was a respected zoologist. His mother, a teacher who later edited films. Their words carried weight in classrooms and studios, but at home they floated like dust in the air. Present, but never settling. Meals passed with the clinking of silverware and the absence of affection. Praise was sparse, warmth even rarer. There were no slammed doors or shouted threats, only an emotional distance that cut deeper because it never had a name. David didn't grow up in chaos. He grew up in indifference, and in many ways that's a heavier burden. Bruises fade, but emotional absence lingers. It echoes in the quiet moments and shapes the way a child sees the world, not as a place of wonder, but as a space to endure. At 10 years old, his mother placed a guitar in his hands. Perhaps it was an afterthought, perhaps a gift. But for David, it was oxygen. No instructions, no lessons, just a wooden frame with 6 strings and the promise of escape. In the dim corner of his bedroom, beneath the soft hum of a bedside lamp, the boy taught himself to speak through sound. The house may not have echoed with laughter, but now it echoed with bending notes, raw chords, and endless repetition. He didn't play to impress anyone. He played because he had nowhere else to go. No one truly listened when he spoke, so he stopped speaking. And when he stopped speaking, he began to play. Music for David Gilmour wasn't a hobby. It was survival. At school, he often stood alone, not angry, not disruptive, just absent in presence, wandering through the hours as if waiting for something real to begin. He wasn't chasing applause, he hadn't yet tasted it. He was chasing meaning, connection, a sound that felt like home. What's striking is that the pain wasn't visible. There were no tragic headlines, no dramatic outbursts. But years later, Gilmour would recall that time with a clarity that only comes from scars long buried. He didn't speak of abuse. He spoke of emptiness, of not being seen, of feeling like a guest in his own life. Not every childhood begins with tragedy. Some begin with silence, and that too can be a wound. For David Gilmour, the wound wasn't what broke him. It's what shaped the sound that would one day heal others. There's a moment in every artist's life when the world stops ignoring them, not because someone finally listens, but because they find a voice no one can interrupt. For David Gilmour, that voice came through 6 strings and calloused fingertips. It was never loud, never flashy, but it spoke in a language more powerful than words. That guitar, simple, unremarkable by today's standards, was a lifeline. He didn't approach it like a prodigy. There were no lessons, no mentor by his side. Just a boy, and a growing need to be heard by something in a house that had no space for questions or softness. Night after night, he would sit in his room, fingers fumbling across the fretboard, replaying riffs from the radio with the obsessive determination of someone trying to translate emotion into sound. It wasn't about learning songs. It was about finding a place to put the silence he'd carried for years. A way to answer back, not to his parents, not to the world, but to the void inside him. As his skill grew, so did his understanding music could carry weight. A single bent note could ache like a memory. A slow vibrato could mourn the things you didn't have words for. Without knowing it, Gilmour was shaping the sound that would one day define a generation. Not because he wanted fame, but because music had become the only place he felt real. Outside that room, the world stayed unchanged. He was still the quiet boy, still the invisible one. But inside, something had shifted. He had found a voice, and it was entirely his own. In school, his classmates couldn't quite place him. He wasn't a rebel. He wasn't a teacher's favorite. He was somewhere in between a presence you noticed only when he was gone. He floated through lessons uninterested in scores or social circles, but when he returned home, that same detachment melted into hours of private devotion to the neck of his guitar, to tones that wept when he couldn't. And here's the paradox: the boy who struggled to be heard with spoken words would become the man whose guitar could silence entire stadiums. It didn't happen overnight, but in those quiet teenage years behind a closed door, beneath the static of late-night radio, David Gilmour began to whisper the first notes of what would one day become some of the most hauntingly beautiful music the world has ever known. Because when no one listens, you either disappear, or you find a way to make the world stop and feel. Talent, they say, will always find its way. But that's not entirely true. Sometimes even the most gifted hands must bleed before they're heard. In the early 1960s, while former schoolmates like Syd Barrett and Roger Waters were gaining traction in London's psychedelic scene, David Gilmour was living a different story, one told in back alleys, smoky cafes, and half-empty train cars across continental Europe. His days were not filled with applause, but with struggle. Not artistic, but physical, financial, human. He joined a handful of small bands, the most notable being Joker's Wild, and set off for France, chasing the promise of music and a meal. The fantasy faded quickly. Guitar amps were stolen. Strings broke and couldn't be replaced. Venues fell through. On more than one night, David had to pawn his own guitar, the very thing that had given him a voice, just to buy bread. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing survival. And that made every note he played feel earned. In Paris, he would play on sidewalks and in cafe corners barely noticed by the crowd. The clink of coins in a case was rare. Still, he played. Because even when no one was listening, the music mattered. Not to the world, not yet, but to him. Each performance was a fight against erasure. Each riff a refusal to disappear. Meanwhile, back in London, Pink Floyd was ascending slowly but surely into cult fame. But Gilmour, he was watching from the outside, calloused fingers and empty pockets, not yet invited into the myth that would one day carry his name. When he finally returned to England, he had little more than determination. No gear, no band. Just an instinct he couldn't silence that his place in the music world hadn't come yet, but it would. Then came the day that would mark him forever. He walked into a studio where Pink Floyd was rehearsing. There stood Syd Barrett. His old friend, the painter of psychedelic dreams, the wild-eyed genius now visibly unraveling. His speech was slurred, his movements delayed. His eyes, once alive with color, were vacant. Gilmour didn't see a musician anymore. He saw a soul slipping away. The contrast was unbearable. Syd had once led the charge. Now he couldn't even remember where he was. Shortly after, Pink Floyd, desperate to stabilize a crumbling frontman, asked Gilmour to join. Not to replace Syd, at least not officially, just to cover for him when he couldn't perform. For a time, the band stood 5 men wide, 4 playing, 1 adrift. Gilmour would later recall looking over during shows and seeing Syd simply standing there, guitar hanging, motionless eyes lost in a world no one else could reach. And then one night, it changed. On their way to a gig, the band made a quiet, cruel decision. They stopped picking Syd up. No announcement, no confrontation, just absence. There's a grief not born from death, but from the fading of someone once brilliant. When David Gilmour joined Pink Floyd, he didn't replace Syd Barrett. He inherited a vacancy, a space haunted by brilliance that had burned too fast and vanished too soon. To the outside world, Gilmour was stepping into a band rising toward myth. But from within, he was stepping into a fractured dream, where the music didn't yet know where to go, and the man who once led it couldn't follow anymore. Barrett, once the fire starter of Pink Floyd, was now a shadow in the studio, silent, withdrawn, his guitar hanging like an ornament from a body that no longer played. The transition was quiet, even cruel. One day, they stopped picking Syd up for gigs. No announcement, no goodbye. Just a silence that said everything. And in that silence, David Gilmour became the band's new lead guitarist. To fans, it was a handoff. To Gilmour, it was betrayal not of ambition, but of friendship. He never boasted about taking that role. He carried it like a weight, knowing he wasn't just joining a band, he was stepping into the void left by a friend, lost not to death, but to unraveling. The band's next phase was uncertain. Without Syd's chaotic genius, they stumbled through the late 60s with experimentation that often felt more survival than innovation. A saucerful of secrets, their first post-Barrett album wasn't a reinvention, it was a lifeline. Gilmour, still finding his voice, played with his back to the audience, not out of ego, but discomfort. He didn't yet feel worthy. He wasn't a frontman by nature. He was a craftsman, building his language in delay pedals and soulful bends. When Pink Floyd turned to film soundtracks like More and Obscured by Clouds, it gave them room to breathe. Commercially low stakes, these sessions gave Gilmour space to evolve, not loudly, but with care. He began to shape a sound that didn't need words to explain itself. Long, patient, sorrowful notes that seemed to reach past the ears and straight into something older, more human. He wasn't trying to impress. He was trying to speak through tone, through silence, through the breath between notes. And then, from that quiet foundation, came something extraordinary. Echoes, a 23-minute odyssey that would become the soul of 1971's metal, was the moment everything shifted. It wasn't a song. It was a séance. A slow, pulsing hymn built from the wreckage of the past and the hunger for something lasting. Gilmour's guitar pinged like a sonar in emotional deep water, searching for something it couldn't quite name. By the final crescendo, it wasn't just music, it was resurrection. The band wasn't imitating the past anymore. They were becoming something else. Something built not on chaos, but on cohesion. And at the heart of that transformation was David Gilmour. No longer the stand-in, no longer the silent replacement, but the breath and the backbone of a new Pink Floyd. By the time the world began to truly hear Pink Floyd, David Gilmour had already spent years wrestling with the sound of silence, Syd's absence, the pressure of expectation, and the nagging question of whether he had earned any of it. When The Dark Side of the Moon exploded across the globe in 1973, it didn't just make history, it redefined it. The album lived on the charts for over 15 years, sold tens of millions of copies, and became a soundtrack for entire generations. But for Gilmour, success didn't taste like victory. It felt like a storm he was barely holding back. His guitar work on Breathe Time and The Great Gig in the Sky didn't scream. It whispered. It wept. It soared just enough to make the heart ache. And still, in the middle of all the acclaim, the applause, the stadiums full of faces there, was a quiet grief, the kind that never really leaves when your rise began the moment your friend fell. Then came Wish You Were Here. And with it, the rawest wound laid bare. Shine On You. Crazy Diamond wasn't just a tribute. It was a funeral set to music. A mourning ritual. The first 4 notes alone felt like tears sliding down cold glass. And when Gilmour sang the title track, he didn't perform it, he lived it. He carried the ghost of Syd in every word, every breath. The public heard brilliance. David heard regret. The deeper the band went into their success, the darker the undercurrent became. Animals in 1977 saw Roger Waters take center stage lyrically, while Gilmour's guitar fought to keep the humanity alive. There was tension now, not just creative, but personal. Waters' lyrics were sharp, political, even cynical. Gilmour's melodies tried to pull the music back toward emotion, toward vulnerability. It wasn't a partnership anymore. It was a tug-of-war. That war reached its peak during the creation of The Wall. While fans embraced it as a masterpiece inside the studio, it felt like a battleground. On the outside, flying pigs, falling bricks, and theatrical genius. On the inside, betrayal, isolation, and loss. During the recording, Rick Wright, the band's quiet soul and Gilmour's closest ally, was forced out by Waters. Gilmour fought to keep him, but the power dynamic had shifted. Wright was demoted to a hired musician on tour. Gilmour watched the band fracture from the inside, and with it, a part of himself. The final blow came with The Final Cut in 1983, where Waters' control was nearly absolute. Gilmour, once the man who rebuilt Pink Floyd from silence, was reduced to what he later called a session player in my own band. His voice was muted, his influence erased. And when Waters quit and tried to dissolve the band entirely, it was more than professional, it was personal erasure. Sometimes salvation doesn't come with thunder. Sometimes it arrives through a single note that refuses to fade. For David Gilmour, that note lived inside Comfortably Numb. A track born in chaos, sharpened in argument, and finished in fire. In the studio, the tension between him and Roger Waters had reached a boiling point. Waters wanted string cinematic clinical despair. Gilmour wanted something different. Rawness, resistance, humanity. What emerged wasn't a compromise, it was a collision. Gilmour's guitar solo didn't just elevate the song, it cracked it open. It soared, it ached, it transcended. And in doing so, it gave him back something the band was stealing, piece by piece, his soul. Yet even that triumph was laced with loss. The stage was growing colder. Rick Wright, once a quiet anchor behind the keys, was now gone from the band. The dynamic that had once made Pink Floyd feel like a shared journey had become something closer to war. Behind the dazzling visuals, the roaring crowds, and the mythology of The Wall, Gilmour stood in the spotlight and felt the distance widening between the band and the audience, between himself and the music. He would later admit, even at the peak, I felt the music losing its meaning. Then came humiliation dressed in vinyl. The Final Cut arrived with barely a trace of Gilmour's voice. It was a Waters album in all but name. And Gilmour, once the heartbeat of the band's second life, found himself reduced to a ghost in his own story. And when Waters publicly declared Pink Floyd over suing to dissolve the band's name entirely, It felt like a full erasure. Headlines echoed Waters' claim. The man who had carried their sound through echo's time, Shine On and Comfortably Numb, suddenly found himself standing in the ashes of someone else's fire. But Gilmour didn't scream. He didn't fight back with interviews or anger. He returned to where it all began, the studio. And there, once again, he let the guitar speak when words couldn't. A momentary lapse of reason, released in 1987 under the Pink Floyd name, wasn't a declaration of war. It was a quiet reclamation. The critics were skeptical. The fans weren't. Stadiums filled. Lights returned. And the silence that had once haunted him began finally to lift. 7 years later, the division bell cemented the rebirth. Its themes of reconciliation and distance spoke not only to the audience but to the musicians themselves. Rick Wright was back not just as a guest, but as a full partner. For Gilmour, it wasn't just a return to form. It was a return to meaning. The music mattered again. The connection was real. David Gilmour resurrect Pink Floyd with dignity and sound. Another collapse was quietly unfolding, not on stage, but behind closed doors. At the very moment when the band he had helped keep alive was fracturing and reforming. The one place that should have offered him peace, his home, was slipping away. He had married Virginia Ginger Hazenbein in 1975, at the height of the band's ascent. She was striking, artistic, full of promise. Their early photos together radiated youth and magic, a rock star, and his muse smiling as if the future were already written in gold. And for a time, it was. They had 4 children, Alice, Claire, Sarah, and Matthew. Their home buzzed with life. Small footsteps, messy kitchens, giggles behind doors. For a man raised in a house where emotion came second to intellect, this was a new rhythm, chaotic but warm. He would later say that coming home from tour to his kids was the only encore that truly mattered. But the silence he had once escaped began to creep in again, not in the form of indifference this time, but in distance. The demands of fame, the strain of touring, the emotional cost of holding together a band built on ghosts and fractures, all of it began to wear through the walls of his marriage. Nights away became weeks. Weeks became months. And Ginger, once radiant at his side, began to fade into the background of a life that didn't feel like hers anymore. The children, still young, would ask why their father was gone so much. There were no good answers, only guilt. Quiet, heavy, gnawing guilt. Gilmour wasn't cruel. He wasn't unfaithful. He was simply absent, not in love, but in presence. And in the end, that was enough to break them. Their divorce in 1990 wasn't scandalous or bitter. It was quiet, just like the silence he had grown up with. But this time it hurt more because it was his. He had built something he desperately wanted to last, and still it crumbled in his hands. Friends who saw him during that period described a different man, hollowed out, emotionally distant, walking into the studio, not with inspiration, but with a burden. His guitar, once his lifeline, now looked like a weight slung over his shoulder. And perhaps the cruelest part was this: the man who had once forged sound from silence now found himself drowning in it again. Not on stage, at the dinner table, in the empty spaces where laughter used to live. The children stayed primarily with Ginger. Though Gilmour remained involved in their lives, he was no longer in the middle of it. He had gone from father in the hallway to father on the phone, and he knew it. Out of the quiet wreckage of divorce and a band long splintered by ego and exhaustion, David Gilmour found something unexpected, not a resurgence in fame, but a return to meaning. And that meaning came not from a chord or a crowd. but from a woman with a pen. Her name was Polly Samson, a novelist, a journalist, and someone who didn't see him as a rock legend or a broken man in retreat. She saw the human beneath the history. She didn't step into his spotlight. She stepped beside him not to complete a myth, but to build something real. Where his first marriage had withered under the weight of absence, Polly brought presence. She didn't ask him to explain his silence. She listened to it. And in time, she began to write words for the music he had never stopped carrying. They married in 1994, not as icons or headlines, but as two people shaped by life's bruises and still willing to trust. That same year, Pink Floyd released The Division Bell, and for the first time, many of the lyrics were hers. Songs like High Hopes carried her voice not just metaphorically, but spiritually. Beneath the soaring guitar, beneath the grandeur of stadium tours and record-breaking ticket sales lived something rare. A private conversation between husband and wife turned public only through melody. The collaboration was never transactional. It was alchemy. She gave his sound language. He gave her words wings. Their creative bond became the quiet heart of a new chapter, not louder, not grander, just truer. Their home, once marked by the absence of a father, now filled again, this time with a blended family of 8 children, 4 from David's first marriage, and 4 more they would raise together. What had once been a house of echoes became a house of motion toys on the floor. Music drifting from behind closed doors, laughter at breakfast arguments over dinner, the glorious mess of a life fully lived. Friends who visited say the change was immediate. Gilmour, once guarded and burdened, now sat barefoot on the floor with toddlers in his lap. He strummed gently while Polly scribbled lyrics a few feet away. It wasn't domesticity for show. It was healing, a new kind of performance this time for an audience of one. Not every cathedral is made of stone. Some are built of glass, anchored to a river, and filled with music instead of prayer. For David Gilmour, that sacred space was the Astoria, a Victorian houseboat he purchased in 1986 and transformed into one of the most iconic recording studios on Earth. Moored permanently on the River Thames, it didn't just float, it breathed. It was part refuge, part time capsule, part altar to everything he couldn't say out loud. Inside, there were no velvet ropes or platinum records hanging an ego, just wide windows catching the morning light, vintage gear humming softly, and the stillness of water lapping against the hull. Hear albums like A Momentary Lapse of Reason. The Division Bell and many of his solo works came to life not under pressure, but in flow. The Astoria wasn't a place where music was pushed into existence. It was where it emerged slowly, like mist rising from the river. Outside the boat, Gilmour's life had become quieter. He and Polly had settled into Sussex, restoring an 8,000-square-foot seafront mansion, Medina House, that had once been abandoned. Like the Astoria, it was less about luxury, more about revival. He wasn't building monuments to fame. He was rebuilding places where life could move gently. At a time when many of his peers were collecting cars and chasing headlines, Gilmour turned inward. He let go of his villa in Greece. He gave away millions in charity. And in 2019, he did the unthinkable. He auctioned off 120 of his guitars, including the legendary Black Strat, the very instrument behind Comfortably Numb and Shine on You. Crazy Diamond. It sold for nearly $4 million. The total auction raised over $21 million, all of which he donated to environmental causes. My guitars have given me everything, he said. Now it's time they gave back to the planet. Even his passions outside of music were steeped in memory and meaning. Through intrepid aviation, he restored vintage aircraft not as trophies, but as tributes to engineering, flight, and freedom. Planes like the P-51 Mustang and the Boeing Stearman became part of his quiet legacy, appearing in film and television, flying once more instead of rusting in silence. There was a time when David Gilmour stood on stage before tens of thousands, and the only thing louder than the music was the silence inside him. But that era slowly and almost without fanfare gave way to something else, something softer, smaller, and more profound. His greatest collaboration, it turned out, would not be with a band, but with a family. With Polly Samson, he didn't just find love, he found rhythm. A lyricist by instinct, she wrote the words he could never quite bring himself to say. And together, they created a new kind of ensemble, one where the instruments weren't just plugged into amps, but woven into the fabric of domestic life. Their children. Romany, Gabriel, Charlie, and Joe didn't grow up backstage or in the shadow of fame. They grew up around guitars left casually on couches, lyrics scribbled beside cereal bowls, and parents whose creativity bled into everything they touched. Romany, in particular, would later join her father on stage, her voice tremulous and honest blending with his in ways no other singer ever could. It wasn't rehearsed. It was familial. Gabriel and Charlie, too, found their way into the music not as protégés, but as threads in a shared tapestry. This wasn't a band built for tours. It was a home where music lived alongside books, firelight, and quiet conversations about life after the storm. Their 2004 project, Luck and Strange, wasn't just another album. It was a family portrait not painted in oils, but in verses and chords. Listeners heard melodies. Gilmour heard the laughter of children growing older. The pages of Polly's notebooks flipping open, the echo of footsteps in a house finally full again. This was not stadium music. It was belonging set to sound. In interviews, Gilmour no longer spoke like a man guarding his pain. He spoke like a man who had finally made peace with it. He didn't need to dominate charts or outshine past glories. He had something far rarer: continuity, not in fame, but in love, not in spectacle, but in connection. At night, as the river whispered outside the Astoria, and Polly sat nearby with a book Gilmour no longer needed. The roar of crowds. He needed only a quiet room, a guitar within reach, and the sound of someone breathing beside him. Someone who had helped him turn decades of sorrow into a harmony that finally felt like home. At 79, David Gilmour no longer stands beneath blinding lights or in front of roaring crowds. He stands in the quiet and he listens. Not to applause, but to memory. To ghosts that once stood beside him, now visible only in sound. Nick Mason is the last of the original guard still by his side. Not a rival, not even just a friend, but a mirror reflecting all that's gone. Rick Wright, the gentle architect behind the keys lost to cancer. Syd Barrett, the flame that lit the fuse, lost to a mind that unraveled too soon. Roger Waters, the visionary turned antagonist, still alive, but forever estranged, the silence between them louder than any argument ever could be. They were once a quartet. Now at best, a duet, two men who remember when music felt like prophecy, when every note could break or bind them. Today, every smile shared with Mason carries the weight of those missing. Every rehearsal echoes a little longer because of those who no longer show up. And yet, Gilmour plays on. He walks the Sussex coast with Polly. He records on the Astoria as the river breathes beyond the glass. He tends the garden with the same patience he once gave to a solo. His hair is white now. His steps are slower. But when his fingers touch the strings, time holds its breath. The sound, clear aching eternal, hasn't aged. Because pain once shaped into beauty does not decay. His fortune remains vast, but it has never defined him. His legacy can't be counted in record sales or ticket stubs. It lives in what his guitar has given people comfort, grief, memory, catharsis. He is not the loudest. He was never the wildest. But he became the one who could make the whole world fall still with a single bent note. David Gilmour is proof that the greatest heroes don't need to shout. They bend time with silence. They turn loss into art. They survive by feeling everything deeply and daring to share it. So when you hear the aching rise of Comfortably Numb or the ghostly shimmer of Shine on You, Crazy Diamond, know this. You are not just hearing music. You are hearing a man who outlived the storms, who buried friends, lost bands, lost family, found love again, and still picked up his guitar. Not for legacy, not for legend. For most musicians, their instruments are tools. For David Gilmour, they were lifelines, extensions of his voice, his grief, his memory. His guitars had carried him through every era of his life, through the silence of his childhood, through the loss of friends, through the rise and fall of Pink Floyd, through the rediscovery of peace. And yet, in 2019, he did something that shocked even his most devoted fans. He let them go. 120 guitars, each with its own story, its own battle scar, were put up for auction. Among them was the legendary Black Strat, the instrument behind the soaring solos of Comfortably Numb, Shine on You, Crazy Diamond, Time, and so many other anthems. It wasn't just a guitar, it was the voice of a generation. When it sold for nearly $4 million, many assumed this was the end of something. But for Gilmour, it was a beginning. He wasn't letting go of his past. He was transforming it. All proceeds from the auction, more than $21.5 million, were donated to Client Earth, an organization that uses law to fight climate change and protect the planet. No press stunt, no ego, just purpose. The global climate crisis is the greatest challenge that humanity will face, Gilmour said. We need a civilized world that goes on for all our grandchildren and beyond. It was the most Gilmour thing imaginable, speaking through action, not volume. Quiet generosity. And it wasn't the first time. Years earlier, he sold his little Venice home and gave every penny, £3.6 million, to Crisis, a charity supporting people experiencing homelessness. He had once pawned his guitar to eat. Now he was giving them away so others might live. That arc from hunger to abundance, from silence to song, from survival to service, defined more than his music. It defined his character. Letting go didn't mean the music stopped. It meant it had finally found someplace bigger to live. David Gilmour has always understood that the loudest voices are not necessarily the ones that matter. In an industry built on attention, he chose resonance. And that philosophy didn't stop with music, it shaped the way he gave. His generosity, like his guitar solos, wasn't flashy. It was precise, personal, and deeply felt. Long before the headlines caught wind of his historic 2019 guitar auction, Gilmour had already been quietly reshaping what it meant to be a legacy artist. In 2003, he sold his elegant Little Venice mansion for $3.6 million and donated every penny to Crisis, the UK's leading charity for people facing homelessness. There was no camera crew, no social media fanfare. Just a man who had once known what it felt like to be overlooked, choosing to stand with those the world too often forgets. He remembered busking on the streets of Paris for coins. He remembered pawn shops and hunger. That memory never left him. It transformed into action. His relationship with giving only deepened with time. In 2019, when he auctioned 120 of his guitars, including the iconic Black Strat, and raised over $21.5 million for Client Earth. It wasn't just a record-breaking event. It was a statement. He could have kept those instruments locked away, enshrined in glass relics of rock history. Instead, he chose to let them go so that the planet might endure a little longer. "The global climate crisis is the greatest challenge that humanity will face," he said. "I hope that the sale will help Client Earth to turn the tide." That wasn't PR. That was conviction. His donations have supported environmental law, refugee advocacy, wildlife preservation, music education, and more. He quietly gave $25,000 to protect the black rhino in tribute to his late friend Douglas Adams, who once helped name the division bell. Every gesture, no matter the size, felt deliberate, tied to memory, to friendship, to a belief that art without conscience is hollow. For Gilmour, giving wasn't a virtue to display. It was a rhythm he lived by. Just as he shaped his sound to carry pain with beauty, he shaped his choices to leave the world softer, fairer, more humane. The sound of his generosity didn't fill arenas, but it moved people the same way one note bent just right can hold the weight of everything left unsaid. Not all artists fade because they are forgotten. Some disappear quietly because they no longer need to be seen. As David Gilmour entered the later chapters of his life, he did not cling to the spotlight. He released it. There was no grand farewell tour, no dramatic public statement. Instead, he made a different kind of choice, one that few legends dare to make. He chose stillness. He chose silence. Not the painful, indifferent silence of his youth, but the kind born from intention, from clarity, from peace. In a world obsessed with speed, quantity, and viral noise, Gilmour slowed down. He became deliberate with his time, selective with his performances, and sacred with his creativity. While others rushed out albums and announcements, he waited. Years passed between releases. But when he returned with On an Island in 2006, Rattle That Lock in 2015, or Luck and Strange in 2024, it was never to chase nostalgia. It was because something inside still needed to be said, even if it came gently with space between the notes. And in that space, there was truth. Gilmour no longer created for approval. He created from experience. The weight of loss, the texture of age, the patience of love, all of it lived inside the music now. His days weren't spent in boardrooms or on private jets. They were spent walking the wind-worn Sussex coast with Polly, or tending to the garden, or recording alone aboard the Astoria as the river shifted with the seasons. He turned down offers that might have padded his legacy on paper, but would have cost him something more: personal authenticity. To many, his absence from headlines suggested retreat. But to those who listened closely, it was the sound of an artist refining his voice, not louder, but purer. Not for the masses, but for those who still sit in the dark with headphones on, waiting for that one note to break their heart gently. Gilmour didn't fight time. He welcomed it. And in doing so, he became something rare, a musician who knew when to speak and when to let the silence say everything. Legends fade. Awards tarnish. Even the loudest stadium applause eventually dies into memory. But some notes, the right ones, never stop ringing. David Gilmour never chased immortality, yet somehow his music achieved it. Not through spectacle, but through sincerity. His guitar didn't scream. It whispered truth. And it's in that honesty that his legacy continues to live, not as a brand, but as a feeling. There's a moment in every Gilmour solo when time seems to slow, when the note bends just slightly and your breath catches. That's not performance, that's presence. It's the sound of a man who lived through silence and came out the other side, not bitter, but better. In a world obsessed with noise, he built a life defined by listening. Listening to grief, to memory, to change, and shaping it all into melody. His music became a kind of refuge for millions. A place where pain is held, where beauty has room to breathe, and where everything you can't say out loud finds its voice in a single vibrating string. And perhaps that's the true miracle of David Gilmour's life, that he didn't just play music. He became a vessel for it. He made vulnerability sound powerful. He made restraint feel like rebellion. And he taught generations that emotional depth was more lasting than any volume knob ever twisted to 10. Today, his legacy lives not just in sold-out tours or best-selling albums, but in headphones on late nights in quiet rooms, in moments when the world feels too heavy. And then that solo comes on, and something lifts. Something opens. He gave his guitars to the planet. He gave his wealth to causes he believed in. And he gave his silence to the people who needed to hear it most. David Gilmour may one day set down the guitar for good. But that note, the one born from childhood solitude, carried through madness fame. Love and loss will keep playing. In every heart it ever touched. In every sky it ever soared across. In every silence that still waits to be understood. Because some music doesn't end. It just becomes part of who we are. If this story moved you, even just one note of it, let us know. Hit that like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to USA Legends Never Fade, the home of timeless stories, unforgettable souls, and the echoes that never die. What does David Gilmour mean to you? Tell us in the comments. Let your voice join the harmony. And don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss another soul-stirring legend. Because here, we don't just remember greatness, we remind the world why it never fades.